let's start with poetry. What is poetry? I suppose that's a large question. Poetry is, thousands and thousands of years old, so it's hard to give one sort of definitive definition of what a poem is. However, let's say for our purposes, there is the guidelines, right? Something that's 30 or 100 lines long. But on that note, we're going to give a sort of general definition that a poem is interested in the line. And that's a definition that came to me from the poet James Hawke, who was my mentor in graduate school for poetry. And his obsession was the line. And I think that's a good way to think of poetry. Poetry is obsessed with a line, not with the idea of sentence, not with the idea of paragraph or grammar or narrative or anything like that. A poem is about what can you fit on one line, what is an idea that fits within a sort of smaller, more economical space than fiction or creative nonfiction. Of course, poetry is creative, similar to the other artistic endeavors that we're going to be talking about, but its focus is on line and then of sound. The origination of poetry is within an oral tradition, and so really poetry is about sonic quality and how things sound to the ear. And oftentimes I think we lose sight of that. Even I lose sight of that, right? We think of poems as being written on a page, right? We talk about the lines as sort of this thing that we see on a piece of paper, right? I can see as I go across, this line leads to that line, etc., etc. But actually, I think when we think of line and sound, we're thinking of ear quality, of how we lead from one idea to the next with the sort of musicality required of poetry. And so oftentimes people are actually thinking of the lines, which is inappropriate as being only on the page. And of course, obviously our journal does appear in a visual space, but one should always check their poetry across the oral quality, the auditory quality that it has. And so that brings us to, once we've defined it, what am I looking for once I sort of establish that definition? And I think with poetry, I'm really looking for sound, of course. I'm a big fan of, the idea of rap and hip hop and the idea of sound quality and words having a rhythm and lyrical nature to them and the way they connect to each other. I'm also looking for obsession with grammar and structure, that people should be cognizant of literally every comma, period, line break, enjambment. Like, what does it do to the sound quality when you introduce words and grammar together across a physical space, so that as I'm reading it, I hear your voice, right? Really, we're talking about voice and oral quality and auditory quality, and that has to do with when I read something without somebody else reading it to me, right? If I'm just reading a poem on a page, how do I hear it? Both in my head, but also orally. If I'm going to read it, how am I going to experience what you've written? Something that's sort of on the Jewish aspect is I'm always looking for a rewriting of Psalms. I think, though, that if I say that, it sort of might imply I want, take Psalm 42 and rewrite it. And that's sort of what I'm talking about. But I don't think so. I think there's something hopeful in the Psalms, a voice that's in the Psalms that's about praise and understanding and looking to something greater. And that's really what I'm talking about. And really, your voice should be using those techniques and those ideas, those thematic explorations to create something of that nature. I'm always looking for something religious, quote unquote, to come in. And it's very rare that we do receive that at the journal. We receive a lot of other ideas and thoughts, but the religious nature of poetry is actually not something that we see very often. And I wonder if there's not somebody who could, or multiple people who could enhance the religious experience surrounding poetry. I know that makes me sound perhaps new age in a way, but there is something religious about poetry in and of itself, right? The early poems seem to be somehow related to the idea of religion at the very least, some sort of observation of something greater, of sound, of euphoria, of just awe. And I think that nowadays we think of poetry as sort of an internal exploration, right? How we feel, how we experience, very, very, very personal. And there is, of course, place for personal poetry. I think, of course, obviously you want to write to sound cliche, to write from where you know, but really to sort of allow that personal experience to fall on the backdrop of awe and wonder and almost prophecy in a very strange way would be nice within poetry. Next is fiction. Of course, fiction, how do we define fiction? Fiction is a narrative, it's a story. It's sort of the fundamental human experience is of telling one thing to another person, that is. And I think when we come to stories by us, again, there are a lot of techniques that can be used within storytelling to create. I don't need it to be linear. I don't need to make sense in a traditional manner, right? It doesn't have to have A leads to B leads to C, or B leads back to A, which leads back to, I don't know, something else, right? We don't have to do backwards and forwards, forwards and backwards. It can be in and out. It can be all around. It can be an exploration of one moment from different angles of something quote unquote unimportant. I think the big thing for fiction that I find is that oftentimes people think of story in the sense of what happens, how does it happen, and how does it kind of make the characters feel. And that's a good way to think of a basic story, right? This happens to that person at that time, which causes that event to lead to the next event, etc., etc. And that's a basic story. But I really think that, again, as a reader, you have to incorporate the reader within your story, and that means enhancing the sensual or physical nature of a story, right? Not only what happens, but how does it make the world feel, or how does it make the person within the story feel? How does the reader relate to those actions? Because it's one thing to say, and he was murdered, and it's another thing to build that murder into an experience where the reader feels the tragedy of that murder, or whatever emotion goes along with that murder, for example. Or even something as simple as I went on a walk today, right? So there's a story there, right? I went on a walk, I saw X, Y, and Z. But how does that make the person, the antagonist or protagonist, depending on who's taking the walk, the protagonist, let's say, how does taking the walk make the protagonist feel as they're taking the walk, and therefore how does it translate into emotional quality for the reader? Oftentimes that's what's lacking in the stories that are not accepted within our journal, that there is information, but there's not emotional resonance. And similarly, something has to happen to make it a story, right? Just because you go on a walk doesn't make it interesting. What happened on the walk to make it interesting? If it's not interesting to the writer, then it's definitely not going to be interesting to the reader. I forget who said this, but part of what makes any piece of art interesting is the idea that it's interesting to the writer, that they are exploring something that they're not 100% confident about, or that they're trying to figure out. And as they're exploring and they discover something new, that discovery is what makes interest. That discovery is what makes something interesting to someone else. And that creates art, that discovery, that new piece of information and new meaning, either that it's literally new, that it's never been seen before, or new in the sense that the author now feels confident in something new, a new technique, a new word, a new phrase, anything new that is clearly driving obsession within the author. That is what creates interest for other people, or any artist really. Art in general, right, is an interesting concept. Why do we make art? What is it for? How do we make good art? What qualifies as good art? That's probably a whole different video, and probably a different video I'll make as to how we think about good art at the JLJ. But let's say with a story, interest is what's going to drive it. If it's interesting to the writer, then it'll be interesting to the reader. Creative nonfiction is actually one of the probably the hardest genre to define. I took a creative nonfiction writing class in college, I want to say, let's say 12 years ago, something like that. Somewhere around 12 years ago, and we tried to define what is creative nonfiction, and I don't think there ever was an adequate definition, and that's both helpful and challenging at the same time, right? Helpful in the sense that we kind of see it and we know it, but also challenging in the sense that it's very complicated to ask other people to submit something when you're hard to define what you're looking for, right? It's like asking a student to read your mind, and there's a place for that in a classroom where you are asking people to read your mind, but it's also sometimes it's just you need direct instruction. This is what I need to be done for this to work. And so when it comes to creative nonfiction, the best definition I have is that it's fiction but true. And what that means is it's a story, but everything that happens has to be true to that story. Not factual, because I don't think, as we know nowadays, as we study history more holistically, the idea of fact is a little complicated, right? To one person, a story happens like X, and to the other person, a story happens like Y, and they're both quote unquote correct, but obviously they have different perspectives. And so fact is, it's not math, it's not 1 + 1 = 2. So when it comes to creative nonfiction, what we want is truth, in the sense of, what do you know is true to the characters within the story, or the situation within the story. So that means, you can't say something happened on a Wednesday when you know it happened on a Thursday, or you can't say somebody felt happy when you know they felt sad. On the other hand, you can sort of postulate around the emotional quality of an experience, even if you're not 100% sure. So if you know the person is a curmudgeon, then an experience that you know is negative probably makes them more curmudgeonly, or their curmudgeon reaction will allow for certain introspective or reactions that occur within their own consciousness, rather than the actual activities that are occurring. Also, what I find interesting about creative nonfiction is that it's not a history book. Oftentimes, a lot of the nonfiction we get seems almost like an article or a Dvar Torah, which is inappropriate. A Dvar Torah is not creative nonfiction, nor is an article creative nonfiction, right? Creative is in the title. Those things are not creative endeavors in and of themselves. Of course, you can use creativity while making them, but you wouldn't call them creative artworks. Dvar Torah is a rabbinical technique that has certain rules and expectations, and applies to within a specific paradigm of what is considered Torah exploration and study. Similarly, an article has journalistic characteristics to it, and has, cite sources and create a document that can be proven, quote unquote, with a factual basis. Creative nonfiction doesn't require those things. It doesn't fall into those paradigms. Instead, it's really about, again, the sort of emotional quality of those stories, of those things, how we interact with the world in a sensual manner, in a manner that is internal, external, and finding the medium between the quote-unquote truth and the quote-unquote story. And so oftentimes when I'm reading creative nonfiction, what I'm looking for is actually not linear story. It's story that has to do with how different, or maybe even disparate, pieces of life come together to create one narrative, so that we don't just see facts of this happened on this day and this led to that event. It's more about how the different events and people involved within those sort of contexts build the idea of story, or build the idea of narrative. And so I think creative nonfiction is actually, in some ways, the most and least interesting at the same time, because oftentimes when I open a creative nonfiction piece, I'm a little hesitant or a little taken aback, because I'm trying to figure out, is it going to hit that sort of, scratch that itch, let's say, for lack of a better term? Is it going to, make me find interest again in that genre, or is it going to sort of fall into sort of the weaknesses I see with the genre of creative nonfiction, or the tendencies of authors to fall into more journalistic or technical writing styles, rather than the creative field that it could be. And so in many ways, creative nonfiction is the hardest genre for me to explore, because it's sort of the least defined, even for myself, and that brings challenges to it. But when you find a really good creative nonfiction piece, it's actually almost the most exciting thing, because it's so rare to find, at least in my opinion, in my experience, where somebody kind of nails the truth of it, but also the lack of specifics or rules that govern maybe the other genres a little more clearly. And so I hope defining these genres and what they are and what they require can help you while you're submitting to our journal, and with your own writing, not even necessarily because you're going to submit to our journal, as to what we are looking for and what these things might be, and how to sort of tackle them within your own writing.